Welcome all to the State of Facilities in Higher Education webinar sponsored by Sightlines. We have record attendance on the webinar today with over 100 people in attendance, and we thank you very much for attending today. I'm Jim Kadamus, Vice President of Sightlines. I'm joined today by Jay Perlman, who is Associate Vice President, and Jay will be moderating the webinar. I'll be working on our facility trends and going through those facility trends. And this is your opportunity also to ask Sightlines. And I'm going to turn this over to Jay and have him introduce today's topic and the agenda. Jay?
Thank you, Jim. We're going to start off today with a quick introduction, talk about some of the underlying landscape that we are all operating within higher education today. From there, we're going to jump right into the meat here, which is a lot of our annual benchmarks, trends, and best practices that we've observed over the last year. And this is new for us. We're really focusing today on you, and that is during the registration for the webinar, we gave you an opportunity to propose topics that you would really like us to drill down into and ask us anything that you would like. We got a great response, and we're going to be addressing those issues directly. And if not, we've made sure that we've answered that we have addressed their comments with content directly in the webinar itself. And then finally, based upon all the annual trends, we're going to highlight some strategies that work at particular institutions. One thing that we wanted to mention is that there's still time to ask us anything. If you look on the screen, probably on the upper right side, there is an orange arrow. If you click on that, it'll open up a window that resembles this. And if you look right in this box here, you have the ability to ask us any questions during the webinar. So we're going to try as hard as we can to answer them all as best as we can within the time that we have. And then finally, if we don't have a chance to answer your question, please complete the survey, which is going to be following this, and you'll have a chance to ask us anything you like there, and we'll respond to you directly with your inquiry. So we thought we'd start out by talking very quickly about where we get all of this information from. And we are ecstatic to have the opportunity to work with over 450 institutions of higher education and a couple of K-12 institutions as well. We're very pleased that we actually have 19 of the 25 top colleges, 17 of the 25 top universities, and very interesting, 42 flagship state universities across the country. We work with actual state systems in 14 states, and of particular interest to us, and one of the things that really makes us particularly excited over the last year is that we retain 93% of our members every year, and we've added 100 new members since the beginning of last year, which is fantastic. What we do at all of those institutions to get this information is apply what we call our ROPA Plus model, and I'd like to turn it over to Jim quickly to talk about what that entails.
The ROPA Plus process consists of three major phases. Many of you who participate with Sightlines have already been through these processes. For those who aren't part of Sightlines work, the first phase is what we call the discovery phase. It's kind of a root cause analysis of your campus facilities, your capital investment, your space profile, and your facilities operations. It helps you look at 5 years of data and identifies trends and helps define how you've gotten to the place you're at. So it uses historical trends and benchmarking to be able to understand your current situation and to understand the relationships between space, capital, and operations. We also have now added a predictive life cycle model that helps you predict capital needs going out into the future. So while the discovery process is the current state and your historical trends, the prediction phase helps you predict the future to understand where you're going relative to facility risk and operating needs. And then finally, the third phase is the performance phase, which helps you identify the best practices. And given the size of our database, we now are able to look across our database to find best practices in about 50 different areas. And this helps you set targets using a key performance indicator or KPI type process to track your performance. Every campus that we work with goes through this process, and it's a consistent way of collecting the data and looking at these relationships, Jay.
Thanks, Jim. One thing that we do with all of this information is every year we compile what we call the State of Facilities in Higher Education article. In it, we highlight broad industry trends, benchmarks, and best practices that really stand out to us over the last year. This webinar is based on a lot of the information found within the article. If you haven't yet, we encourage you to visit our website and download your free copy of the article. So we wanted to start off with an introduction, and I wanted to talk about some of the higher level strategic trends in higher education today. And I want to start with a quote. And I want you to read this quote. One side effect of rapid growth has been the creation of an increasingly large obligation for the future renewal and replacement of the physical plant. This sounds very familiar, and this could have been written last week. And what's very interesting is that this was written in 1980, 34 years ago. This is when, as an industry, we began really talking about the concept of deferred maintenance and the need for campus renewal. You'll hear us talk about different periods of growth in a few slides. The difference between today and 1980 is that we're facing challenges today that weren't there in years gone by. It used to be we could answer a lot of the problems that we had with growth. We saw expanding enrollment, bringing in more students. We saw rising fees, bringing in more dollars. And the reality is that we can't really respond like that anymore. There is an overall decline in the number of high school graduates across the country in many states. This is particularly present in a lot of states in the Northeast and the South, where enrollments are beginning to actually decline. The number of students to attend institutions, it is not going up like it has in years past. We're coming out of the recession, and resource levels at institutions have not yet responded on the facility side to get back to where they were in 2009. We'll explain this both on the operations side and on the capital side as well. Outside support from states is steady at best. In most states, it's declining. Again, the capital and operating investments for campuses have fallen in terms of real dollars and when you adjust for inflation. And we're in this particularly interesting time now, and we'll talk about this in great detail. We have two groups of spaces right now competing for the same renewal dollars. Spaces that were built in the rapid expansion within higher ed in the 1950s and the 1960s, as well as complex, newer structures built in the time from 1995 that require keep up the dollars to keep them functioning the way they should. And what we think we need to do is actually change the conversation about this. And this is an interesting kind of visual that we've put together. In the last 3 years, we've reacted to a lot of the decline in resource availability by, looking for ways that we can cut operations and looking at ways that we can decrease capital spending. And that's appropriate. When you don't have the dollars to spend, we have to find ways to reduce overhead impact. The one thing that we didn't see right away that we're starting to see now, and we'll talk about a lot, is discussions of the root causes. And we really think that those root causes that affect operations come in two discrete families: issues that surround space and issues that surround capital allocation. We're starting to see conversations around campuses right now that are really focused on, do I have enough space? Am I utilizing the space that I have in the best possible way, that I get the most value out of it? Do I have ways that I can use my physical assets better so I can release hidden value, as we call it? And this is a discussion that is oftentimes replacing that of what's the next building that we build. And it's an important one. And then finally, on the capital side, we all know that capital dollars are going to be largely down, especially in the public arena. But the reality is that it's oftentimes not about how much you have, it's about what you spend it on. And making sure that we have capital allocation strategies that not only do the most to enhance the program of the institution, but also do enough to simultaneously maintain the technical assets and reduce a lot of the critical backlog issues that have been accumulating over time. So we're going to start off by talking about each of these, and we're going to start with a group of slides that really discuss space, intensity, and age. I'm going to throw it over now to Jim.
Thanks, Jay. Our first chart looks at space versus enrollment growth. And as you can see, contrary to what a lot of people think, we've actually been building less space than we've been growing enrollment. There was a very rapid period of growth in enrollment from 2007 to 2012, over 10%, while we grew space at a rate of around 6%. In the last year, we're beginning to start seeing in 12 and 13 now, last couple of years, a leveling off of that growth, and I'm going to show you in a minute by type of institution. So while that growth curve was going up very rapidly, and we were building additional space, but not at the same rate as growth, it means campuses have gotten somewhat more dense because we've added more students, but not so much space. But that's beginning to level off. When we break this down by type of institution, we see an interesting picture. Only one of the three types of institutions that we tracked here, research institutions, continue to see that growth curve growing up even as of 2013. We've seen no leveling of research institutions, in part because I think many of them are a desired institution within their region or within their state, and they offer a lot of programs, and in many cases now, because of the shrinking numbers of students, it might be many students are looking towards research institutions and have the possibility of attending school there. Comprehensive institutions had a very similar growth curve to the research institutions up until about 2012, and now we've seen not only a leveling but a slight decline in comprehensive institutions of all kinds. These include public and private. And our small institutions, which are primarily private institutions, you're seeing that enrollment decline hit starting around 2011, and it's continued in 2012 and 2013. What's also interesting is the small institutions are the only institutions now which are growing space faster than they're growing enrollment. In part because of increased competition, these campuses have increased some of their residential space, they've increased some of their student life space, they've increased some of their science and research type of space to attract students, but right now that growth curve is not there in terms of the enrollment. So these are some of the effects of the declining enrollment. We expect to be watching this very carefully over the next few years as enrollment declines continue out until about 2018, 19, 20, when they will kind of level off nationally. When we look at public versus private, you can see that the public institutions still growing. Private institutions actually started leveling off around 2011. Our database is split about 50-50 here, so we've got lots of institutions in each of these. And you can see the enrollment growth, though, is pretty similar. The space growth is pretty similar between these two types of institutions. One of the things that we're tracking very carefully is the aging campus. This graph looks at the amount of space under 10, 10 to 25, 25 to 50, and over 50, both public and private, and the national averages, and looks at this based on renovation age. So we have reset the clock on any building that has been, where at least 50% of the replacement value has been addressed in a group of projects that are resetting the clock on mechanical systems within that particular building. And you can see from the national standpoint, there's been some shrinkage in the 25 to 50 category, but primarily because of the shift over to the 50 to 100. So it's not necessarily making progress, it's just the amount of space under 25 and over 25 stayed pretty much the same over the last 4 or 5 years, up a little bit since 2007. Similar story on the public and the private side. The difference is that public institutions tend to have a lot of space in that 25 to 50 age category. Many of these institutions grew very rapidly in the 60s and 70s, and now those buildings are the ones that are causing a lot of issues, and they have a very high concentration of space in those age categories. The private tends to be a little bit mixed. Many of the private campuses that we have are older campuses. Many of them are in the Northeast. They were ones that were built, you had buildings built 100 years ago. Many of those buildings still exist, have been renovated, but many of them still are facing renewal cycles, and they're over 50 years old. But the overall story here is that the progress on the aging campuses, despite some significant investment of dollars that did level off after, as Jay pointed out, after the recession, but there's still been significant capital investment. But we've not been able to reset the clock that much on these spaces over since 2007. One of the reasons for that is this waves of construction. Jay mentioned this earlier. This tracks all of the buildings that we have and all of the space we have on our entire database, about 1.3 billion square feet, and looks at the year in which the building was originally constructed. So we go all the way back to 1880, which is our oldest building on our database. And when we take a look at this, you can see that about 40% of all of the square footage was built from about 1951 to 1975, what we call kind of that post-war era. Much of that space was lower quality construction. It was being built very fast to deal with the veterans that are coming back from the war and the baby boom generation that came in the 60s and 70s. And you can see that that is all the space that is causing a lot of people the issues around deferred maintenance. Many of these buildings have not been renovated, as we just showed on the last slide, and as a result, they are past due. At least one life cycle is past due, and many of them are approaching 50 years old. Will all approach 50 years old in the next decade. Then there's a complex era from around 1991 to currently, which is what we call about 27% of the space. Kind of the complex buildings. Many of these have very high numbers of air exchanges. Many of them are LEED certified buildings. They are more technically complex. And if you think about the terms that Sightlines uses on catch-up versus keep-up, you might want to think about that post-war 40% as the heavily catch-up era buildings, the complex area of buildings, the complex space, your keep-up. And what we're finding is that essentially there's just not enough money to go around to deal with this catch-up and keep-up. And you can see that there's no other time in the history of space that we've had both of these types of challenges hitting us at the same time. Another factor that we've been tracking, and this was not in the paper, but we've kind of added this to this webinar, and that is we've been tracking academic versus non-academic space. And there are really only 2 times since 1880 where academic and non-academic space came close to being 50-50. One was around 1960, and this is the percent of space built in that particular year. So around 1960, it was about 50-50 in terms of academic versus non-academic space. Sort of makes sense because the non-academic space was essentially residential and student life space that was being built for a growing population of baby boomers coming to college. And now, around 2000, in the current era, we're getting very close back to that 50-50 time, starting in around 2010, where we've got a lot more non-academic space being built. In part, this is colleges and universities responding to demands of students for recreational facilities, growth in the athletic programs, which would be non-academic, as well as some of this are these 1960s dorms coming due and people replacing that space with new, more modern suite-style dorms and other type of new, modern living quarters. But it's interesting to see that, even as back in the 1940s, 1950s, 70% of the space being built was academic. Now it tends to be non-academic as well as academic space, and that's, I think, affecting some decision-making on campus as we take a look at the space profile. So, Jay, that's sort of the picture on space and age and density, and I think we have a question around this.
Yes, Jim. We actually received a question yesterday during the registration process that fits right in here. The audience member asked if you could better define the concept of renovation age versus construction age, and I think you've already done that for the most part, but if you wanted to elaborate on that at all, that would be helpful. But they also wanted to see the concept of renovation age seemed to resonate with them as sort of a top-down indicator of capital requirements ongoing. I'm wondering if you could give an example of an institution or a group of institutions that kind of use that as a way to guide investment.
Right. Well, you remember this slide just from a few slides ago when we showed the national, public, and private average renovation age. And as I pointed out, renovation age is at least 50% of the replacement value of a building has been replaced in a project, so it means that the clock has been reset on the mechanical systems of that particular building. So it's functioning more like a modern building, not like a building when it was constructed. As we can see, there's been a very little progress if you were to look at the blue and the red compared to the yellow and the black. Essentially, the percentage of under 25 and over 25 space stayed relatively constant since 2007. Been slight improvement, but really almost no improvement since 2009, since the recession hit. I want to show you a state system that we work with, one of our 18 state systems we work with, where they've actually been able to reset that clock. And take a look at what they've done. They've set policies within the system and within the campuses to target buildings that are in that 25 to 50 age category, knowing that they're poorly constructed, knowing that they need renewal, and recognizing that in some cases they need replacement. And in fact, in this particular state, they had a policy of renovation through replacement. That is, they would encourage campuses to knock a 1950s and 60s building down and replace it with a brand new building. And as a result, through both academic and residential, academic and non-academic space, they've gone from 59% in 2003, from the 25 to 50 era, down to 32% in 2013. And they did it without letting a lot of buildings cross over into that over 50 age category. You can see that the over 50 category in 2003 was 13%. It's now 14%. Their peer campuses, as you can see, have made slight improvement in improving the under 25 space, but mostly the changes in the yellow occur because the black is growing from 16 to 21%. So this system, through its policies and practices and incentives that they've created, financial incentives, have really made a difference. And back in 2003, you could see that they had under 30% of their space, 28% of space under 25. They're now up to 54% of their space under 25. So much better balance in their age profile and less renewal needs coming due. So it can change, Jay, over time. And it's in about 10 years.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jim. We're going to switch over right now and talk about a lot of our statistics regarding capital investments over the last year. And again, I'm going to throw it over to Jim.
Good. Well, this chart looks probably eerily familiar to most of the campuses out there. For the public sector, 2009 was essentially the high point. There was a slight recovery into 2011, but then since then there's been another decline, another cut in funding. primarily, if you look at this, the blue is the institutional capital. That is money coming from the institution, which, as you can see in the public sector and the private sector, is growing, versus the money that's coming one-time capital in the public sector, primarily state funding; in the private sector, primarily bonding and gifts. In some cases, in the public sector, there's also revenue bonds that are part of this. But you can see that the private sector peaked also in 2009 and has not recovered, although there's been some improvement since the recession in 2010, where there was over $1 a square foot drop in a single year among our private sector campuses. So capital investment is, in real dollar terms, is certainly less than it was based on 2009. One of the things that we did look at is what's happening in institutional capital. And what we're hearing from a lot of campuses is that in the private sector, we can't rely on in the public sector, we can't rely on the state anymore to come in here and bail us out and provide the resources they once did. So we're going to focus more on trying to budget for institutional capital, get that as part of the capital budget. Some campuses are charging fees now to students and financing capital improvements through fees. But you can see that in 2007, campuses spent about 89 cents a square foot in institutional capital. That's now up to $1.35. The private sector has always had a lot more annual capital budgeted, primarily through endowment as well as through capital budgeting within their own campus. That's now increased from $1.69 to $2.02. So I think a good trend that we're seeing more annual investment, what we might call in Sightlines annual stewardship, coming in as part of the capital program. 52% increase in the public sector, 20% increase in the public sector. As a result of that aging that I showed you a few minutes ago and the reduction in capital funding, or at least leveling of capital funding, we're seeing the backlog going up. This is total backlog, which includes not only, it's essentially a 10-year backlog number, and it has grown from about $79 a square foot to about $92 a square foot, about a 17% increase since 2007. When we break this down public and private, we see that the public sector, because it's experienced less capital overall and more cuts in capital, in fact, is now up to $99 a square foot, approaching what many people say is a critical stage of $100 a square foot, which would in fact result in campuses having a very difficult time being proactive. Private sector is also growing, about 15% increase in their backlog. It's about $85 a square foot, and I think partly because the private sector has had more historical capital over time, been able to invest that on a regular basis, more annual capital. And so certainly the picture on backlog, Jay, is not a pretty one, certainly, and it's not pleasant, and definitely continuing to rise.
Understood. Jim, I'm going to interrupt again. We have a question from the audience, and it fits right in here talking about backlog. And you've already addressed this slightly, but maybe, again, you can expand. The audience member has always struggled with the definition specifically of what's included in the backlog. Everybody seems to have a different one. We want to, is there sort of a best practice for defining what the backlog is? But then he says that his numbers have typically been so high that they don't have an impact. There's sort of an inaction or inactivity above him because there's no clear idea about how to address the problem, which almost seems too big. So is there a better way that we can define it and then break it down in a way that can help drive strategic plans more effectively?
You know, because we got this campus question ahead of time, I was able to pull out some slides from one of our campuses that we work with that helps you better understand the backlog and how we define it. And so this campus has a total dollar backlog around $230 million over the next 10 years. And we've been able to break that down into three parts here. One is the renewal need, which are life cycles coming due between 2014 and 2023. So over the next 10 years, what are the life cycle needs that are coming due? That consists of about $107 million. The second category is what we might call critical deferred maintenance. which is the next 1 to 3 years. These are projects that we call up in the Sightlines reliability projects. They usually constitute between 8 and 12%. On this particular campus, is 10% of the need. And these are critical projects that actually can affect the reliability and the functioning of the building. And then finally, the third category is the remaining backlog, which includes not only repair and maintenance needs, but also modernization and updating needs that might occur in a particular campus, and that's $100 million. So that 230 breaks down this way, and I think it's helpful to think about critical deferred maintenance. It was just in a state recently where the legislature keeps talking about, well, they want to limit the amount of critical deferred maintenance, and trying to find the right definition, I think, is really important. And this particular strategy does help you say, well, this is what is really the most critical and has to be addressed first. What's interesting is that when you start thinking about this, on this particular campus, what we did is we plotted when these things are going to occur. So we looked at the 10-year renewal need, and you can see that that 10-year renewal need does not come in equal portions each year. Some years it was only about, it was under $5 million. In other years it was in the $10 to $15 million range. And so how do you address those? And then you add on the critical needs, the immediate needs, which occur in that first 2 years, and then the remaining need, which will occur over the next 8 years. So you've got your total backlog here. And this particular campus only had, when we started looking at project capacity, had about $120 million that they were going to spend, or about budget of about $12 million a year projected over the next 10 years. So when you look at that and map that on, you can see that in some years they're in pretty good shape. Like in 2014-15, they're going to be able to stay ahead of the problem by addressing all the life cycle needs that are coming due, and take a good bite out of their immediate needs just by their current budget. But when you get out in terms of 2016, 17, 18, 20, 21, you're looking at years in which the renewal needs alone, what's coming due, could eat up their entire capital budget, and they would have no impact on their backlog. And so being able to understand all three of these aspects of the backlog and being able to develop policies that can look at capital execution, priorities on projects, making sure that you're addressing the immediate needs, making sure that you understand when those renewal needs are coming due. If you've got to take steps in your operations, do the things to extend the life cycles of those particular systems and maybe buy a few more years on your HVAC systems or your roofs, and not have them all come due at the same time, and kind of spread out these renewal needs so that you have time to address your backlog. So I think that's a way of responding to this caller's question.
Great. No, thanks, Jim. That's extremely helpful. We have a couple of more questions. What I'm going to do is hold off on a couple that we got, because I believe you actually answered them in the coming slides regarding operations and utility consumption. So with that in mind, let's roll right into our stats regarding operations and talk about things that kind of stand out in the day-to-day departmental administration.
Well, the picture on operating budgets is not pretty at all in terms of the amount of money that's going to operating budgets. This is measured on a dollar per square foot basis. And as you can see, these budgets have been pretty flat since 2009. They were growing a little bit in 7, 8, but since 2009, a very slight growth, about 1% a year. You can see that the blue is the daily service costs, maintenance, custodial grounds, staffing, supervision, contracts, materials. The red is the planned maintenance amount. We can attribute to planned maintenance.
The party you have called is not available. Please record your message after the tone. When you have finished, you may hang up or press pound for further options.
I'm going to continue with this, but I assume that was some other technical problem. So I'm going to continue with this. But as you can see, the operating budgets have been flat, about 1% a year. We also track this with modest inflation numbers, about 2.5% increase in inflation. And you can see, had we had inflationary increases, and we apply this both public and private, we found that in public and private, we were ending up with about $5.22 a square foot for the public, and about $5.33 a square foot for private institutions. And so what we're seeing is that we're just not keeping up with inflation, and as a result, we started looking at staffing levels, and you can see that staffing levels are increasing. This is represented as gross square feet per FTE, so coverage rates. The national average now is approaching 90,000 square foot per FTE. The public institutions are a little bit over 90. The private are just slightly under 90. But both of them have been increasing fairly steadily since 2009 when the recession hit and everybody began to really tighten their belts on the operations side. When we take a look at custodial coverage, almost a steadier increase in coverage rates, which means fewer staff. On the national average side, we've gone from just under 35,000 square foot per FTE to about 38,000. Public is now approaching as much as 40,000 square foot per FTE, and the privates are just under 35, but they were down in the low 30s at one point in time. So staffing is getting leaner. People are being stretched more. Operations are being stretched as we go along.
Great.
Do you have a question on the staffing side and the operations before we go to energy?
Yes, Jim, that was actually the question that came in that I wanted to wait for. It's about calculating staffing numbers. And the audience member acknowledges that there are so many standards and so many different ways for calculating staffing, but there seems to be no one-size-fits-all methodology. So the question is, how do we do it, and are there best practices for calculating staffing metrics? And I'm going to start to answer this question, and I think it's multifaceted. The first issue is, how do you get the number right? And you're absolutely right. There are so many different ways that we can calculate staffing, and over the years, we've learned how to be incredibly rigorous on this. And the first thing is getting that denominator correct. We spend a lot of time at institutions trying to figure out what's the right denominator, and usually it's gross square feet, but in the case of grounds, it might be acres. But there can be a number of different square footages for one institution, and in that case, you're absolutely right. There is no one-size-fits-all number. Knowing how to use what number when is very important. So when we typically go to a school, we will calculate the number of square feet up to 6 or 8 different ways: gross cleaned, energized, electrified, heated, cooled, etc. Figure out the best way to benchmark. And the other thing is getting the numerator correct. The other thing that is important to do is to look pretty critically in staffing, not only for your total working FTEs, but to make sure that you calculate the supervisory contribution correct. There are a lot of institutions where there's a lot of split responsibility. An employee might be supervising half the time, but also have actual work responsibilities, and knowing what that number is affects your staffing ratios. But the other thing is knowing, getting an accurate count on the sole service component of your staffing, and knowing the correct number of square feet to compare those against. If you basically quote, sell FTEs to entities that are either auxiliaries or are not included in what you would call your maintenance footprint, you have to account for that, and that's important. That's aside from the issues of how do you interpret it and what does that number mean.
Yeah, and also contracting, if you contract out certain parts of your services, such as custodial or parts of your grounds, you'd have to calculate that. And also things like custodial staff spending times on moves and setups where they're not actually working in the buildings and cleaning the buildings. So I think, Jay, you've really hit it right on the head, that you've got to be real careful and rigorous with these calculations when you do comparative metrics on the staffing side. Good.
Thanks, Jim. Well, we're going to roll right into utility numbers. It is very close to operations, and then following this, we have actually received we have a couple of examples from institutions that have folded utility consumption and operations to make real positive impacts at their campuses.
Well, the energy use story is actually a better story than we've shown with some of the other metrics, and that is that we've seen about a 7% decline in energy use. There was an increase from 12 to 13, primarily climate-driven because of cold winter across the country. But overall, we're seeing normalized energy use on a BTU per square foot basis going down. Campuses are getting more efficient. Buildings are getting more efficient. They're more rigorous about both use of fossil and electric, and have, in fact, been able to achieve that. That contrasts with the fact that total energy use is up, although remember what I just showed you in the earlier times on space, and total energy use is up around 2%. So when you just look at total MMBTUs, but as I showed you earlier, space is up around 6 or 7%. So actually, we've built a higher percentage of a new space than we've grown the energy total consumption, and as a result, the amount per gross square foot is actually going down. So I think we're seeing some positive trends on the energy side. One of the big trends that's very interesting is where fossil is coming from. In 2007, about 75% of the fossil consumption was natural gas, and 25% were other sources, coal in particular, oil as well as coal. Now that's down, has really shifted in a very short time, 7 years, has gone to about 85% natural gas and about 15% everything else, particularly driven by switching from oil to natural gas in the Northeast, switching from both oil into natural gas in the South, as well as coal and oil in the Midwest to natural gas. So natural gas is becoming a real big source of fossil fuel, continues to increase, and been a pretty dramatic shift in a very short period of time. We're talking about millions of MMBTUs of consumption here. As a result, utility emissions are actually going down. So the combination of less consumption and cleaner fuels using natural gas has actually resulted in about a 13% decline on utility emissions. So the carbon footprint of college universities is really going down, both when you measure it on a student FTE basis and per 1,000 gross square foot basis. So making some progress on the energy front, but primarily through fuel switching in some more efficient buildings and lower consumption.
Great, thanks, Jim. This is where I wanted to stop to answer the next question from the audience. And somebody specifically asked, we mentioned in our article a number of times how it is advantageous for an institution to increase planned maintenance and to try to use that to offset the daily service costs every year. The question is, can you highlight some strategies that have worked to effectively do that, and being that resources are fairly scarce? So I wanted to actually talk about one institution that I have experience with that I thought did something fantastic, and that is they made the case to the senior ed administration to create a policy that sent and protected savings on the utility side, or at least a portion of them, to be reinvested into the campus to do more either energy conserving projects or actually increase planned maintenance dollars to slow the rate of deferral at the campus. And they did that on the back of a very effective energy management strategy. And over the last 5 years, this particular institution saw a decrease in cost of about 6% over 5 years. That provided some amount, but very aggressive management led to actual 19% decrease in consumption on the campus. The actual net result of that was a 24% decline in cash expenditure on utilities. And because of the policy decision that they helped make, what they were able to do is shift a lot of that money into capital project spending. And if you click on that chart, Jim, you'll see that specifically they spent that money on mechanicals, envelopes, and infrastructure, specifically to save more energy and to fund capital projects that wouldn't get the programmatic allocations or the dollars from outside the campus that other types of more glamorous work would. At the same time that they did that, they actually used that money to also double the investment real positive move, using the money saved from utilities as a way to improve the campus as a whole and make the campus healthier in years to come as well.
I wanted to show also a second example here, Jay, because a lot of people say, well, if you've got some savings from the energy side, you can increase PM. But we were able to discover a campus here that actually has been seeing a shrinking dollar in terms of their operating budgets. When you look at the peers versus this campus, they're spending about $5.61 total operating budget versus $6.12. They were up over $6 a square foot back in 2007, but as you can see, they've hit pretty hard by cuts in the campus. They've gotten some recovery in the last couple of years, but when we take a look at them against their peers for this last year, just on the daily service side, they're just spending a little bit over $3 a square foot. Their peers are spending almost about $3.75 a square foot, and many of them are spending over $4 a square foot, and that's that daily service budget over time, which was close to $4 back in 2005 and dropped all the way below $3 and just slightly over $3. So you would expect that when you see these kind of cuts, one of the first things that goes is plan and preventive maintenance. People just say, when I'm getting cut staff and I don't have the resources, I'm just going to focus on that reactive work orders, those daily service calls, and forget about planned maintenance. But what's interesting is in the face of these cuts, this particular campus actually doubled the amount of planned and preventive maintenance. What the facility director did here is basically say, if I'm going to have less staff, I'm going to try to become more proactive with that staff. I'm going to get focused on setting priorities for the work orders that are coming in, not reacting to every daily service work order as though it's equal. Obviously, if you've got crisis issues or the roof's leaking and the toilets overflowing, they're going to address those. But other minor calls were prioritized. They put a blower on the list, and they really became dedicated starting in 2012 and 13 to really be focused a lot more on planned and preventive maintenance. A lot of that's driven by both in-house and some external contracts, but basically they've doubled the amount. They're above the peer average now in the face of pretty significant cuts over a period of about 6 or 8 years. So give them a lot of credit. Their jury's still out. They've just started doing it the last couple of years, but they say they're seeing positive results on the campus and positive reaction from the campus community that they're getting ahead of the problem.
Wonderful. Jim, I'm gonna pause right here and ask you a couple of the questions that have come in over the last few minutes here, and one of them goes back to staffing. The viewer is wondering how much the increase in square feet per FTE is based upon the application of new technology versus constrained labor resources. And I would actually provide option 3, which is new technology driven by the fact that there are constrained financial resources.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's happening out there is that, necessity is the mother of invention, right? People have been getting cuts. They've extended their staff. And in many cases, it's not even cuts, Jay. It's adding square footage without adding staff. So we've added 6% additional square footage, but we're not adding more people. We're just making our current people extend their work across that square footage. Now, in some cases, that can happen because it's newer square footage, and as a result, doesn't maybe need as much attention or can be handled through a good PM program. But in other cases, I think there's been a number of campuses that we've seen that have introduced new technology, different ways of cleaning methodologies, green cleaning, different types of equipment. They have also been able to use some more creative maintenance practices that have allowed them to use technology, track their work orders better. Many campuses are now using iPads and an iPhone kind of technology to be able to track calls and be able to allocate their staff more efficiently. So I think people have technology that's making a difference in both on the maintenance and the custodial side, and in terms of understanding work orders and managing work orders better.
Thanks, Jim. Another question that we have that I'll start to answer, but you can absolutely elaborate on, it is regarding utility consumption. And the audience member acknowledges that community colleges are absolutely going to have lower utility consumption or very different utility consumption or utility needs than, say, a larger research university. And how do we break out space types and institution types to better tell a story? A lot of those, the easy answer to that is absolutely. We do break it down in finer detail, and for the sake of time, we didn't add a lot of those slides in here. But off the top of my head, when we're compiling data and when we're trying to find best practices and really what the average numbers are across groups, we are looking at things like size of institution, the constituent group of that institution, the Carnegie class of that institution, climate zone of that institution, region of the institution, and interesting things like the percentage of residential students on the campus or the percentage of research space of that institution. So yeah, we do work pretty hard to break down those numbers, and if you see at a lot of our more regular blogs or in a lot of our monthly newsletters, you'll see a lot more detail as we drill down into particular areas of facility operations.
I think with community colleges, of course, the density number is a telling number. I think typically our small liberal arts institutions, four-year liberal arts institutions would have a density of about 250 students per every 100,000 square feet. Research and comprehensive institutions more like 350, urban institutions more like 500. Community colleges can run 750 to 1,000 in terms of the number of people per 100,000 square feet. So they have less space, more students, more concentration of students. But also the other factor here is that community colleges' time of operation is longer. People will come in starting early in the morning and they'll have classes all the way to 10, 11 o'clock at night. That means things like coverage rates for custodial are very, change a lot, because you've got to have a group that's cleaning at night for the group in the morning and another group that's coming in late in the afternoon cleaning for the next group at night. And so you've got multiple shifts here, the custodial staff, that always have to be attentive, and we really see that reflected in the metrics for community colleges. So they're kind of unique in high-density institutions, and we look at them in a very different lens than we do, say, a small liberal arts college.
Absolutely, and one thing that I wanted to stress that our member institutions will recall is whenever we come to a new campus, one of the first things that we do is work with you to determine what your peer group is. We always want to make sure that when we are conducting comparisons at a campus, we have the best group, and we're telling the story both accurately from your standpoint, but fairly representing you across institutions that matter. So that would actually be the first thing that we would do at an institution.
Yeah, and that's important. That's important because many of the data that we have in reports like this are used by policymakers at state levels, at institutional levels. People bring the data to their boards, the presidents, and people want to be able to know that, be assured that it's an apples-to-apples comparison. The benchmarks are accurate.
Great. Thanks, Jim. I wanted to conclude this by talking about some strategies that we've seen at institutions for navigating, the waters that we just went through. And again, I wanted to do it in the context of this graph. We talked about space, how people are taking a critical look at making sure that they're getting the most out of the space that they have, about allocating capital in the best way, and then having those to drive operations rather than the other way around. I want to talk about 5 different broad strategies that we've observed at institutions that are helping them move the bar forward.
Well, thanks, Jay. Let's go at kind of these 5 strategies one by one. The first one is build strategically. Today's facility challenges really require multiple strategies to make a difference. Since the 1990s, institutions really relied on big one-time infusions of capital as a replacement for recurring capital sources. But as a result of the recession, we're seeing overall capital funding decreasing. And so the money available for renewal projects is not always there when you need it. And so campuses have been turning, and as we showed in the data, to annual capital to fill the gap. So that means thinking differently about investment strategies, because you're not always going to have the resources just when you think you're going to have the resources. So finding a regular source of funding and then being able to use that one-time funding strategically to deal with the biggest problem is very important. A second strategy of being successful is less can be more. As we pointed out in our data and many other reports that have been done on deferred maintenance and backlog, a lot of doom and gloom out there, and there's no sugarcoating it. The numbers are high, and on many campuses, the situation is critical, and the resources are not there. The problem is the old strategies of renovating buildings in turn are no longer going to work. Campuses are going to run out of money before they run out of buildings, and so picking the right projects is critical. I showed earlier a chart that defined critical deferred maintenance, and in many campuses, though, it's between 8 and 12% of the projects that are affecting the reliability and the functioning of the building. Being able to identify those projects and making them a priority is vital if we're going to be able to be successful with fewer resources. It's also critical to make sure that any investment in new space either replaces old space that's worn out or is critical to supporting the long-term institutional mission where you're serving the highest number of students. Third strategy is look ahead. A simple analysis of age really tells you the story, right? We've not been able to look ahead, but we do know that life cycles of major building components are predictable. We have models built into our ROPA model that actually does be able to predict when life cycles are coming due and really be able to predict those life cycles, look ahead when they're going to come due, and develop strategies that create a balanced age profile where the capital needs can be distributed over the years, over a number of years. One of the biggest problems is if you have a lot of concentration of space in any one age category, it's all just coming due at the same time. And so being able to balance that and have a balanced age profile and look ahead and be able to project when things are going to happen and allocate resources properly is an important step. Fourth strategy, keep up. If anybody who's worked with Sightlines knows, we talk about annual stewardship and the importance of keeping up. That is regularly investing capital to meet life cycles on an annual basis. We call this annual stewardship. We found that through our 14 years in business, that $1 invested annually can actually help you avoid $3 to $4 in costs later. There is a cost of waiting to address deferred maintenance issues, and it's often 3 or 4 times the cost of doing it now. And so being able to invest on a regular basis is important. Finally, the last strategy is reward savings. I think it makes sense to assume that operating budgets are going to be flat. We're at a time of uncertain enrollment and financial health, and CFOs really want to control the operating budget that's spent on the physical assets. And so we need to think about how to reallocate time and resources and create policies that incentivize operators to be more proactive and more strategic, as we showed in some of the examples. Even 50 cents to $1 in operating budget savings recycled to plan and preventive maintenance can really have a multiplier effect on the campus appearance and the efficiency of the campus. We also talked a little about energy. I think there's still, we've made some progress on the energy front, but I think there's still plenty of opportunities to reduce energy consumption. But one of the things we're hearing from presidents and CFOs is show me projects that not only reduce energy, but also have a multiplier effect of addressing some of the deferred maintenance like HVAC systems and upgrading utility plants and underground piping. And so CFOs are looking for return on investment on those energy projects. The bottom line on all of these is when we look at them across the board, we know that operating practices combined with strategic capital investment and better space policies is really a winning combination. Jay?
Wonderful, Jim. Thank you. We're just about at the end of our 1 hour here. I'm glad to say that we did manage to answer the vast majority of the questions that were emailed in during the hour. Before we conclude, I did want to mention a couple of things. First of all of this material and then some is detailed in the article, which you can download on our public website for free. But also there are ways that you can stay in touch with us more regularly and hear more detail about specific issues. You can sign up right on our website for our monthly newsletter if you haven't already. And then we spent a lot of time blogging about case studies, best practices, success stories, and all kinds of issues, at least monthly, sometimes every week. We can have those automatically sent your way as well if you subscribe to our blog or if you friend us on LinkedIn.
With that, thank you very much for participating today. Remember, you can complete the survey after the webinar ends, so just stay on. You'll be able to look at that survey. If you have any additional questions, there's a place on that survey to provide those questions for us, and we'll answer them. Again, thank you for participating today. We enjoyed having you and enjoyed answering your questions. Have a good day. Bye-bye.